Okay, it is 1 minute past 1, so I think we'll start and the rest can join as they have time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It is my privilege to introduce Chantal Orense. She is our lead for plant biotechnology, and she's going to give us a nice overview into the science and the regulation, as well as the stewardship of biotech products. So we're looking forward to a presentation this afternoon. Thanks so much, Chantal, and over to you.
Thank you, Alriza, and good afternoon to everybody. As Alriza mentioned, I'm the plant biotech lead at CropLife South Africa, where I'm responsible for the plant biotech portfolio, just in terms of regulatory and policy issues, as well as stewardship and advocacy. So this afternoon, I'm going to just take you through the science, regulation, and stewardship of biotech products, and also sketch what that looks like in within the South African context. Okay, so if we can get started. Okay, just 1 second. There we go. Okay, let's get going. Okay, so this is my presentation this afternoon, just an overview of the topics that I'm going to be covering. You'll see that we'll first start by looking at plant biotech within the context of plant breeding, looking at the specific science behind it and the terminology, as well as the South African regulatory landscape, looking at the adoption trends, both locally and globally, as well as stewardship aspects and sustainability of the products, and also looking ahead to see in terms of what's next on the innovation pipeline. Okay, so if we start, we need to go back, quite far back, in fact, to plant breeding, because all of the milestones in plant breeding is responsible for the modern day foods that we have on our shelves these days. And so this was achieved at the very beginning, or lots of years ago, from our early plant breeders through domestication of wild species through human intervention. And this was through the selection of plant varieties that tasted better, that yielded more, that had bigger fruits, and that were more adapted to the specific growing conditions. And these selections were based mainly on visually what was seen. But if we move, I think, to the most obvious example would be to look at maize. If we look at, this is the origins of maize, which is Steosinte, the wild ancestor, which has its origins in Mexico. And it's through many years of human intervention, saving seed, replanting and selecting the improved varieties, and also just distribution across the globe in terms of, adapting to different conditions that eventually brought us to the hybrids that we are more familiar with today. So just to illustrate here that, human intervention has always been part of our food modification system and our food supply. Okay, so just again contextualizing. So in the early days, it was just through domestication, it was through selection and crossbreeding that we were able to generate improved varieties with better traits. And so the plant breeding toolbox continued to expand as we at the beginning got to learn more about genetics, and especially the fact that plant genes are actually linked to specific or desired characteristics. And I think this process was accelerated after the discovery of DNA in the 1950s, and again establishing that link between genetics and useful characteristics. And this then just prompted, the modern plant breeding tools, which we are going to be discussing today. All right, so if we go and we take a look at the science and the terminology, because let's face it, it can be quite confusing. So in the late 1970s, I would say, early 80s, that is when the discovery of molecular tools were made by scientists. And this included the ability to copy a gene for a desired trait and move it from one plant to another. And the resulting outcome of that was a genetically modified organism. And so this ability obviously opened up, a lot of opportunities, but the first applications of those were not actually in agriculture, but were in the medical field. And this application was used to modify bacteria so that they were able to produce human insulin to treat diabetes, and that was in the early 80s. This was followed by the first genetically modified food that was introduced into the marketplace, known as the Flavor Saver tomato. And this was a tomato that had a longer shelf life. So this is just to show you that with the advent of these molecular tools, how quickly the applications then followed in terms of making those steps in plant breeding to give us improved varieties. Okay, so if we go and we look, what exactly is a genetically modified organism? As I mentioned, it was the ability of scientists to go out in nature, discover what genes provide or function as useful traits or code for useful traits, to identify these, to extract these, and then to copy them over into plants, and to introduce then that useful characteristic into plants. So in terms of GMOs, it is the addition of external or foreign genes into a living organism to give it that added trait or beneficial trait. This application has given us, let's just see, there we go. This application has given us plants to date that has improved characteristics such as insect resistance, herbicide tolerance, drought tolerance, and then also those with nutritional qualities. I think the most well-known of these is golden rice. Okay, so if we look at how it functions as a breeding tool, plant biotechnology, we'll see that it's just a combination of tools that enables breeders to add these traits for crop improvement. And if we look at the process is sometimes called genetic modification, but depending on where you are in the world, it might also be called genetic engineering. And as I said, it's the enabling of genes to move or be copied and transferred between unrelated species. And if we look at just the end product or the outcome of this process, results in what we call a GMO, and that is the terminology we use in South Africa as it relates to our Genetically Modified Organisms Act. But as I mentioned, you'll find that maybe in parts of North America, it is referred to as genetically engineered product. It might also be called a transgenic crop. It might also be called biotech crops. So these terms are used interchangeably, and yes, understandably, they can be quite confusing at times. And so what is the advantage of this plant breeding tool over the earlier breeding processes? Well, earlier breeding processes crossed superior parent plants and resulted in random changes in the genetics, whereas this plant breeding tool is more targeted and has a more predictable outcome in terms of the products derived. New varieties, can be developed in a more shorter cycle or time period, in terms of it doesn't take as many generations to actually arrive at a GMO product. And then also these tools have to date already, provided products or improved crops with benefits, just in terms of agronomic, environmental, and human health. So that is just to distinguish what plant biotechnology tools, how they are different from the earlier tools, and what benefits they bring to the plant breeding continuum. Okay, so now if we take a look at the GMO regulatory landscape in South Africa. So regulatory oversight is provided by the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, specifically the Directorate Genetic Resources. And so the primary act that regulates GMOs is the Genetically Modified Organisms Act. And the main function here is to regulate the risks associated with GMO activities. with the intention of limiting the possible impact it has on the environment, human health, as well as animal health. The Act also establishes institutional arrangements, which aids with the assessment of GMO products or applications, as well as decision-making. So if we just take a look to the graphic over here. So if I am a technology developer and I submit an application dossier, the first process would be to submit it to the registrar, which is the administrator appointed in terms of the Act. And based on that application, the registrar will appoint advisory committee, and the appointment will be based on the types of scientific expertise required to review that application. And these are independent scientists coming from various institutions and universities. Once that advisory committee has reviewed that scientific dossier, they then make recommendations, and these recommendations are then forwarded onto the Executive Council, which is the final decision-making body in this process. And just to point out that at this point, I think the Executive Council is represented by 8 different government departments, including Department of Health, Environment, I think there's Science and Innovation, there's Labor, Arts and Culture, and then of course Agriculture as well, and Trade and Industry. And so each of these representatives from these respective departments need to make sure that when that application is being considered, that the mandates of their respective departments are also complied with. And so this process, it's not a one-way process. It could go back and forth several times between the Executive Council, the Advisory Council, for follow-up information, depending on the questions that come up during that process. And if the council is satisfied that the product may be approved, it has met all the risk assess or the safety criteria, then it will issue what we call a permit. And this permit will then be issued for the specific application activity that is being requested. So if it's contained use, which is lab activities or activities in the greenhouse, then the permit would be specifically be issued for that. And all the permits that are issued are conditional, meaning they come with specific requirements that need to be met during that period of activity. So yeah, that just briefly is how the regulatory system works in South Africa. So if we take a look, it's not just the GMO Act that is considered. Remember, I said to you that each government representative on that council needs to consider their mandates and relative acts that they are responsible for. So if we look in terms of the Department of Health, they would consider safety issues, food safety issues in terms of the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act. If we look at the environment, they will be looking at the considerations and impacts to the environment in terms of the NEMA Act or the NEMBA Act. And then also just there are socioeconomic considerations as well with the DTIC, the Consumer Protection Act, which has established, I think it's labeling regulations for GMO products. I can say that to date, those regulations have not yet been fully implemented. So these are the types of considerations that go into the decision for the council that is, and the members that are represented there. Okay, so what does the risk assessment criteria look like for GMOs? As I mentioned, that risk assessment dossier is quite extensive, it's quite comprehensive in terms of the data and the studies that are submitted as part of that application. And so just in terms of the different pillars that are considered, you will see that Close attention will be given to the molecular characterization of the GMO, this specifically looking at what trait was introduced, giving a description of it and analyzing its insertion into the plant, and then also what modification techniques and processes were used. So that is some of the data that would need to be supported there. In terms of food safety, important aspects here would be the toxicology of the product, allergenicity, the compositional analysis. Is it nutritionally equivalent to, a conventional crop? And then, of course, feeding studies. Just to mention that for each of these risk assessment categories, the comparator is always the conventional variety. So if we're looking at maize, GM maize, the comparator would always be conventional maize to see, is there statistically anything significantly different when comparing it to conventional maize. And that would be considered for each of these elements that is listed here. If we look at environmental safety, the concerns there would be gene flow into the environment, moving from the GMO crop, how compatible is it with its surrounding environment for gene escape? Is there any impact on beneficial organisms or non-target species? And then obviously the ability for the trait to persist in the environment, specifically weediness or invasiveness. And then obviously most important is, the potential to build up resistance to either the other inputs that are used in the management of the crop. So the molecular characterization, the food safety, and the environmental safety, those are all specific safety issues. But then apart from that, there's also socioeconomic impacts, what we term non-safety issues. And these will be considered in terms of, does this GMO product, is it going to have a negative effect on farm income? Is it going to affect our ability to produce enough food? Is it going to drastically change the way we farm, our agricultural practices? And then also very important is its impact on trade and markets, because as you know, South Africa does not exist in a vacuum. And so we trade globally. So, the consideration there would be, to what extent is this going to affect our ability to trade, both import and export? Okay, so that's just a quick, I think, overview. Of course, for each of these points listed here, and this is just highlighting some of the elements under each of these categories, there's a substantial amount of data that needs to go to support the risk assessment that is being reviewed. Okay, so if we look at just which activities are regulated, as I mentioned, all activities are authorized by a permit, and each permit comes with conditions that the permit holder needs to comply with. And so the types of activities that are regulated is activities in the lab. These are under contained conditions, either lab or greenhouse trials. And then there's also field trial activities. These are typically activities in the field to generate performance or agronomic data. And these occur at specific, contracted farms or research premises and take place over 2 to 3 seasons. And then there's also general release activity, which is just essentially commercial cultivation, which is then allowed, as well as commodity clearance. This is the approval of a GMO product for food, feed, and processing, but not for cultivation. And of course, with each of these, there are specific conditions that need to be met. And I think just to general release and commodity clearance. The approach that is used is the steered risk analysis. And so as we move from contained to general release, there's this increasing risk assessment requirements and risk assessment studies and data that needs to be submitted. And obviously this comes at significant investment and costs in terms of the experiments and the trials that need to perform to generate all of this data. Okay, and then as mentioned, besides just moving to the commercial release, once there is commercial release, then that's where the trade kicks in, and then import and export activities are also import and export activities are also done through the issuance of permits. Okay, so that is just looking at the GMO Act, but people seem to forget that when we look at GMO seed, that is not the act that applies. We also need to consider that on top of all of that, there is the Plant Improvement Act. And so those GM seed samples also need to be submitted for evaluation trials. And these evaluation trials are also 2 to 3 seasons. And this is required, in terms of listing on the national variety list, because seed can only be sold if it is listed on the national plant variety list. And so for these evaluations, they will then ensure that, there is in actual fact value for cultivation and use. And it also upholds the seed to specific quality standards. So that is the one aspect. The other aspect is after it's granted GMO approval, it also needs to be submitted through the Plant Breeders' Right Act. And this act then grants rights to plant breeders for certain varieties of plants. So if the plant breeder can prove that, the varieties are new, distinct, uniform, and stable, then plant breeders' rights can be allocated to that specific variety, which enables a system of collecting royalties back to the breeder, which could then be reinvested for further varietal improvement. And so it's only after those processes, together with GMO approvals under the Act, that seed then can become commercially available for cultivation. So it is a long process, and people don't normally, are not aware that there's all these additional steps on top of just getting it approved under the GMO Act. Okay, so if we look at just the biotech crop adoption trends, if we start in South Africa, well, I think South Africa has a history of about 23 years of cultivating biotech crops. And if we look at the status of adoption, we'll see that soybean production, 95% is actually GM soybean, 85% of maize production is biotech, and then all of the cotton produced in South Africa is GM cotton. And so, South Africa has a track record. And if we look what that translates to, it's about just over 2.1 million hectares that was planted in the 2021-2022 season. This amount of production has mostly stayed the same over the last couple of years. And important to note that we don't only cultivate GM crops, we are also an importer, specifically of grain, GM grain, during times of shortages or times of drought. And this is most especially animal feed. And then also during times of surplus, we are also able to export that to some of our neighboring countries, as well as to some of our trading partners in the East. And the history of GM crops also includes yield improvements for farmers, and the dominating cultivars or high varieties are those with insect resistant and herbicide tolerant traits, and that being both single traits as well as stack traits. So this is just a slide that was shared with me from Grain South Africa, and this is just to show maize production over the last couple of years. And you will see that from what's around about the 2000 mark, that is when GM crops were first introduced, there was a incremental increase in the amount of maize tons produced per hectare. And you will see that the average record today is that South Africa produces over 5 tons of maize per hectare. And the illustration here is not to say that this is solely attributed to GMO crop adoption, but just to say that the accessibility and availability of these biotech varieties has, to some degree, contributed to these improved yield gains. Okay, so if we look at adoption locally, as you know, South Africa doesn't only have commercial farmers, we also have semi-commercial, we have smallholder farmers. And there has been documented and peer-reviewed publications showing that the availability of biotech varieties in South Africa has led to improved yields, as well as improved farm income and livelihoods, and also reduced the usage and the number of agrochemical sprays, and specifically with herbicide tolerant crops also improved no-till or reduced tillage practices. So this overall has given more flexibility to farmers, in terms of labor savings and their time. And this is not only just, documented in publications, but also as CropLife, we do interact with small scale and semi-commercial farmers through our advocacy programs and our farm demonstration trials. And, we have first-hand information that this is in fact the experience of farmers in terms of these benefits translating to them subsequent to the adoption of biotech crops. Okay, so if we look at beyond our borders to the north, what's the status of biotech in Africa? I think this is the 2007 map, and you can see that, South Africa at that time was the only country that was cultivating or had adopted biotech crop varieties. The rest of Africa was still resistant or reluctant, and mainly attributed to, political pressure, the heightened activism, obviously making lots of noise and putting more, pressure on the politicians to hold off on the technology. And also, I think at that time, there was very little countries that had made any efforts to actually put legislation in place. And also, because of this void being filled by activism, it created a lot of skepticism within those populations about the actual science and also safety concerns. But there is some good news. If we fast forward to 2021 and we look at the map now, we will see that several countries have in actual fact put their biosafety or GMO legislation in place, and they are in fact all moving towards at least accepting that the technology can assist improving their production yields, as well as helping with the food security issues. So you will see in Nigeria we have BT cowpea, and then there's also cotton in Ethiopia, and I think that's Malawi and Kenya. So there's been some progress, and I think even beyond 2021, there's a few additional countries that have also come on board, realizing that that the technology can actually support their efforts to improve production in those countries. Okay, so if we look globally, we will see that biotech crops have been around for the last more than 25 years. It is planted most notably in the North and South Americas and parts of Asia. Europe mainly still, I guess, not accepting the technology, and cultivation there just being limited to Spain. But I think important to point out that Europe is one of the biggest importers of GM animal feed. It's just that they do not allow cultivation. And so if we look at the number of farmers, it averages 18 million farmers across the globe. And a lot of these, or majority of these farmers are actually smallholder farmers. The main crops here are soybean, corn or maize, cotton and canola. And yes, it's still mainly insect resistant and herbicide tolerant traits that dominate the market. Okay, so just in terms of the contribution over the last 25 years, there has been benefits translating to farmers in terms of just yield, improving their income and livelihoods, and also labor saving benefits. In terms of the environment, there's been, reduced environmental footprint with less use of chemical applications. Of course, greater conservation tillage practices with less disruptions to the soil, and then obviously that in turn reduces the number of CO2 emissions with less tractors having to move over farms, and then also just helping to improve biodiversity because we were able to farm using the same amount of land and not needing to encroach on protected land. And then the benefits for consumers has obviously been the availability of safe and affordable food, sustainability of production, and making sure that the products that are available are better, just in terms of nutritional value and ensuring just less food wastage. And overall, yes, the technology has contributed to global food feed as well as fiber security. So that is just the global landscape. If we look a little bit at stewardship, yeah, this is for us at CropLife, I think, a very important element of whether it's any technology use or whether it's any crop protection tool, is stewardship. And this is essentially just defined in terms of ensure that there is responsible use across the entire life cycle of the product from its inception, from R&D all the way through the end of its life cycle. And what this in practice means, it's making sure you take extra measures or you put extra measures in place to make sure that there's limited impact on the surrounding environment with these products from start to finish. And so if we look at just from a product developer perspective, why is it important? Well, the current statistics or coming from a CropLife International study is that the cost and time to deliver a GMO product to market, the time has in actual fact increased. So now on average takes 16 and a half years from the time that from research and discovery to actually getting a product on the market, 16.5 years. And the cost that goes along with that is 150 million. The cost has actually come down, but still 115 million is quite a big chunk of change. So yeah, and what the study showed is that a large chunk of that time, half of the 16 and a half years, is essentially just trying to get the product approved through the various regulatory systems. And so this is because in each territory or region, each regulatory system has its own requirements. And so that's why it seems from one market to the next, it takes longer and longer just to make it through all those regulatory hurdles. So in terms of just time and cost, it's important that if you are going to invest that amount of money and that amount of time, from a product developer perspective, stewardship is important. You want to make sure that, you actually get return on that investment. And one way to do that is by ensuring stewardship of your product so that it remains effective for a lot longer. And so that delayed innovation obviously, has negative consequences for the farmers who are waiting for these improved innovative varieties to become available to them. So that's the current status of how long and how much it costs to get a product, a GMO product, from start to finish into the market. And so just an important point to raise, I think, just why stewardship is important. And so other than just the time and cost, why else is it important? Well, it's important to make sure that when the products are on the market, they remain effective for a long time to come. And this requires responsible use. And it's important that, if these products are available, remember, they don't only bring benefits to farmers, but they also bring benefits to consumers and overall to the environment. And so, yes, that is why stewardship matters, and that is why it's a topic that is very important for CropLife South Africa. Okay, so if we look within the South African context in terms of compliance and monitoring, the main crops that is cultivated in South Africa is insect resistance and herbicide tolerance. And so the main issue here in terms of stewardship would be the management of resistance. And important to note is that, resistance management is a requirement or mandated requirement wherever biotech crops are grown, that's including in South Africa. So in the US, Canada, Australia, it's important that resistance management practices have to be in place. If we look in terms of the GMO Act, it requires permit holders to specifically monitor resistance management strategies. They need to develop compliance plans to counter resistance if there is any detection in the market or out in the commercial fields. Also, they need to make sure that there is a surveillance plan for detecting resistance development, and they need to educate also the end users or the buyers of their products to make sure that they understand what stewardship is all about and what the requirement is in terms of managing resistance. And not only is it important that all these plans and actions are in place, but they also, permit holders need to report on this annually through submitting a report to the registrar at DALRAD, and this is required for all commercially approved traits in South Africa. So that's just how resistance management is mandated in South Africa. Okay, so if we look specifically, as I said, insect resistance and herbicide tolerant traits and how they work as a crop protection tool. Okay, so insect resistant traits, these are just crops that have the inherent ability to produce proteins that are harmful to target insects. And the most common one is the Bt insecticidal proteins. So if we look at insect-resistant traits such as the Bt crops, you will see that various Bt genes, known as CRY genes or vegetative insecticidal protein genes, have been identified and isolated from Bacillus thuringiensis soil bacterium, and these traits are introduced into crops either as a single Bt trait, or if there's more than one of them that's introduced into crops, then it's known as a stack trait. And just important to point out that each one of these Bt insecticidal genes represents a different mode of action. And of course, when we're speaking resistance, that would be important where there is more than one mode of action built into a plant. Okay, so those are the different genes that produce insecticidal proteins. And so what happens is if targeted insects feed on the plants, what happens is the toxin then specifically disrupts inside the insect's gut, and that results in death of the insect. And so this inbuilt kind of immunity, offers protection against damage from targeted pests. As a result of that, there's increased yield gains, not specifically because this is a yield gene, just because of reduced damage from pests, and then also reduced pesticide applications because you wouldn't need to apply as many applications for all the target, for all pests that are infesting the crop. And then these specific Bt toxins or proteins are not harmful to beneficial organisms. They are very specific in terms of the pest that they target. And then also just in terms of safety, they have been safety assessed very rigorously through the regulatory system. Okay, so what are the specific target pests for Bt traits in South Africa? These are lepidopteran insect pests, specifically maize stem borer and spotted stem borer. That's specifically what they have been registered for to provide protection against in South Africa. But just to mention that they do also to some degree provide protection against damage from fall armyworm, although not specifically registered for fall armyworm in South Africa. Okay, so in terms of what is the number one stewardship management practice that goes with the planting of Bt crops or insect-resistant crops? Refugia. Farmers have to plant refugia, and the main reason is to reduce the risk of pests developing resistance to the specific Bt protein inside the crop. And this refuge is essentially consists of a strip or a block of a similar variety, but it does not contain the Bt trait. And this just allows or delays the onset of resistance, because if there is one resistant pest in the Bt field, it has a good enough food supply adjacent in the refuge so that resistance is not allowed to build up over time. So if we look specific at how a refuge should be planted, in South Africa, there are two options. The one option is to plant a 5% non-Bt refuge, 5% of your total production area. With the 5% requirement, there's just no chemical spraying is allowed. You need to plant it, or the varieties need to be similar to that of the Bt crop so that they mature at more or less at the same time. The minimum requirement is 6 rows, and there should definitely not be any mixing of Bt and non-Bt seed within the rows. And at all times, that refuge should be planted within a distance of 400 meters from the Bt production area. The other alternative is a 20% non-Bt refuge, and this does allow spraying with registered chemicals, but as long as it's not a registered Bt pesticide, it is allowed. So that is the essential requirement, number one stewardship requirement when it comes to the production of insect-resistant crops or Bt crops. There is just, a refugia is not negotiable. Okay, so if we look just in general, of course, it's not just about, planting or cultivating Bt crops. It should be considered within a broader insect pest management program. And of course, diversity here is key. You want to use a combination of different agricultural practices to ensure that there isn't resistance build up over time. So some of the best practices that are recommended to be followed, is the refuge. Of course, the non-Bt refuge is number one. It's important that there is scouting in the fields for insect damage. It's better to be to find these or detect earlier than later. So scouting is recommended. And then, of course, when it comes to the application of insecticides, not for the target crop, but for the non-target crop. Because remember, Bt is specific only to the lepidopteran pests that were highlighted earlier. And so rotation of insecticides is important, especially with different modes of action. That is another way to just make sure you delay resistance buildup. And of course, here, the important thing is to make sure that you read and follow the label instructions, because it's important that the correct dosage and timing rates are followed for effective management. And the recommendation, of course, is also, where possible, to use insect-resistant hybrids with multiple traits. different CRY genes, because each of those represents different modes of action. And then, of course, just good agricultural practices such as crop rotation as well. These are all the recommendations that need to be considered together with BT crops, just to prevent the delay or onset of resistance. Okay, so if we look at herbicide-tolerant traits, these are traits that provide plants the ability to resist the application of certain broad-spectrum herbicides. And the example here is glyphosate-tolerant crops. So if we look at how this works, so herbicide-tolerant gene was extracted from soil bacteria and copied and transferred into our crops to provide that added benefit. Single gene herbicide-tolerant trait, obviously that's a single trait variety, and then of course if there was more than one herbicide-tolerant gene inserted, that would be a stacked trait. Again, the combination of genes provides more than one mode of action. And so with this gene inherent in the plant, the broad-spectrum application of herbicide kills specifically the weeds, but doesn't affect the crop at all. And then the benefits of this would be that fewer herbicide applications are needed because of better weed control, reduced tillage practices, and because the soil is less disrupted, nutrients and water can be well preserved in the soil. And for a lot of farmers, weeding involves lots of labor. So with this option, it gives farmers greater flexibility in terms of their time and the flexibility also for weed control and obviously labor savings. Okay, so what are the best practices when it comes to managing resistance with herbicide-tolerant crops? I think it's no different from the general application of herbicides. It's again, make sure that your herbicide-tolerant crops are part of an integrated weed management program, because herbicide-tolerant crops on their own cannot provide 100% weed control. So it's not a single solution, but again, should be used in combination with other management practices, including cultural, mechanical, and chemical measures. And again, the recommendation is to use herbicide-tolerant crops that have multiple stacked traits, because this provides more than one mode of action. Again, scouting for weeds is essential. Make sure you catch your weeds early on rather than later when the field becomes overgrown and then it's less manageable. Where applications are needed, herbicide applications, again, important, noting the different modes of action and to apply responsible use by reading and following the label instructions. Crop rotation, good sanitation, and then, of course, tillage practices. So if we look at, the accessibility of commercially approved biotech seed in South Africa, it's important that farmers purchase these from a registered seed supplier. This is a requirement in terms of the Plant Improvement Act. And when such purchase of seed takes place, there is a technology or stewardship agreement that also exchanges hands. And this is an agreement between the seed company or the technology developer and the grower or whoever's purchasing. And this goes with the sale of every biotech seed purchase. And so this is essentially a terms and conditions, agreement, and it goes together with a technology user guide, which essentially gives you the do's and don'ts of how the biotech seed being purchased needs to be cultivated. And of course, one of those requirements is specifically to reference what the refugia needs to be planted. And then when accepting this agreement, the grower agrees that they will not resell the seed. They will comply with resistance management practices, and also as and when required, they will participate in the company's monitoring program which requires them to report on their stewardship and resistance management programs to the regulators annually. But it's not just of a benefit to the technology developer. I think to some extent, this agreement also gives some assurances to growers, just in terms of the quality of the seed that they are buying, the technical support, and also just a reporting mechanism should they have specific issues with the seed. Okay, so if we look at just GMOs in general, I think it's been coming on 25 years, and there's been lots of dialogue, conversation, and debate on GMOs. Yeah, that discourse has been, I think, let's see, heavily involved with the activists making lots of noise. And so with all of these actors in that space, two, I think, of the most common questions that often come up is the safety issue. Are GM food safe for consumption? Yeah, and the standard response to that is that in each and every territory, before a GMO can be cultivated, before it can be used for food or feed, it is subjected to rigorous regulatory systems. And in each of those territories, data needs to be submitted and is reviewed by the regulators in each of those countries. And I think the standing now is in 48 countries already. And even though it's in 48 countries, those systems haven't come back with, specific safety incident with regards to GMOs. So, yeah, they are one of the most highly regulated products on the market. And not only have, their safety been verified by regulatory systems, but also the safety has been validated by independent scientists and international organizations, including the European Food Safety Assessment Association, one of the most strictest, I think, in the world. So that is just the response on the safety issue. And then another question that often comes up is, why can't I save biotech seed? So I think this is not unique to biotech seed. It also applies to hybrid seed, conventional hybrid seed. I think there is no rule that says you can't save your biotech seed. I mean, that's, even though when you sign that agreement, you agree not to resell it. But I think, replanting, even if you were to go ahead and replant that saved seed, over the long run, the integrity of that seed just declines and the volumes go down. So, yeah, it would make sense then that while you are able to save your biotech seed, in the long run, you are not going to get that return on investment. And then also just in terms of the South African context, the newly amended Plant Breeders' Rights Act does make provision for this concept of farmers' privilege, where they do allow farmers to hold back some seed for replanting, but I think the condition is that they cannot sell. So after they have harvested, they cannot go and sell seed again. So that privilege has been provided for within the recently amended Plant Breeders' Rights Act. But yeah, it's just that when you do replant your saved seed, you do so at own risk. Okay, so if we just look a little bit into the future in terms of where we stand with innovation in agriculture, I think, yeah, we've probably heard these statistics many times before, but yeah, the global population is moving fast ahead in terms of growing. We're expected to grow to 9 billion people by 2015. And in order to feed all of those people, agriculture will need to really step up and produce 70% more food. And that is not an easy task, considering we are doing this with the backdrop of rising food prices, rising costs of inputs. It's just becoming more expensive. And also just the realities of climate change. And so if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that were developed by the UN. This is essentially a global call to action to end poverty and protect the planet and ensure prosperity for everybody by, I think it's 2030, which happens to just be around the corner. There's definitely if we are to meet these goals, there's definitely a sense of urgency that, it cannot be agriculture as usual. That definitely there needs to be innovation, and innovation needs to try and help us take us to be able to meet these goals by 2030, because at the current trajectory we might just fall short. So definitely, there's a sense of urgency that something needs to be done to make sure that agriculture is able to do all of that, feed the world, protect the planet, and also just mitigate climate change. So looking ahead, is there anything next in plant science innovation? And yeah, there definitely is. I'm sure the latest buzzword is genome editing tools. And again, it's a tool. It's an innovation tool. And it's, again, just to point out, an extension of earlier plant breeding. And so if you look, it's a diverse group of tools known as zinc finger nucleases, CRISPR, TALENs, and etc. But these are all just cutting tools that are able to snip DNA very, very precisely. So they work like genetic scissors. And I think what is different here is that they are able to edit the plant's own genetic code. So it's not necessary to go outside and extract an external gene and bring it into the plant, which is what happens in the case of GMOs. But no, these tools, the applications of these tools enable to introduce these changes in plants in their own DNA, in their own genetics, specifically for crop improvement. And as a result, because they are able to introduce changes that are similar to the changes that happen in nature, the resulting products, are also similar to those that are developed through conventional breeding methods. Why there's so much buzz around these genome editing tools is that the advantages is it's much cheaper, it's more accessible in terms of scientists, and also there's just a shorter innovation cycle associated with the application of these tools in terms of bringing a product to market. It doesn't have to take 10 plus years. The innovation cycle can in actual fact be shortened to something like 5 years, obviously depending on the crop that is being worked on. And so, I think one of the biggest challenges with these new tools is that, the way they are regulated globally, and then also just societal acceptance. And these two issues will determine just to what extent this technology is adopted, and to what extent the benefits will actually be realized. Just within the South African context, disappointingly in 2021, South African regulators took a decision to regulate all applications of genome editing as GMOs. This is unfortunate because the science dictates that the the risk profiles of GMOs versus plant genome edited products are distinctly different, and that it's justified to actually have a different pathway for genome edited products. Okay, so we look just globally, where do we stand in terms of policy developments? You will see there is some, converging consensus around distinctly, regulating genome edited products differently from GMOs. That is indicated by the different levels of green across the map. Unfortunately, that is not the case in South Africa, which is highlighted there in red. So so while we got off to a good start initially with the adoption of GMO technology, it's not looking too good in terms of the next our access to genome editing tools, which is the next thing in terms of plant breeding innovation. Okay, so in terms of what products are on the market already, in the US, they have a product called Conscious Greens, which is essentially developed by Pairwise, and this is mustard green salad leaves that have a less pungent taste. And this product, I think there it says it took probably about concept to market. I can't see my own. Okay, I think it was less than 5 years. The other product on the market is the Gabba tomatoes, which is a product coming out of Japan. Tomatoes with high GABA content, which is good apparently for lowering blood pressure. Other products on the market is the reduced browning bananas. I think this was developed between the Philippines and the UK. And yeah, this would be good for just in terms of spoilage or wastage of reduce the wastage of bananas. And then also just this high oleic soybean oil, which has a more healthier fat content. So that is where the plant science and plant breeding is moving to, giving us even more innovative, I think, tools for plant breeders to work with in an effort to help us meet all those development goals that need to be met. And so I think this is where my presentation ends, but maybe just a few final comments is to say that definitely technology and scientific innovation has a role to play in our present and future food supply, but also pointing out that there is no silver bullet. It's going to take a combination of innovations and tools to get us to that finish line. And then, yes, the farmer's toolbox is expanding, and to try and keep up with the demands and the increasing pressure on the planet. And so, if we embrace technology, then yes, there will be options in terms of sustainable solutions to help us produce more with less, and also just to mitigate adverse climate conditions. And then, of course, sustained access to biotech tools requires responsible stewardship. And it's important to ensure that we have continued delivery of safe and affordable food, not just for consumers, but also, improved varieties that benefit farmers as well. So that essentially is the end of my presentation. This is just contact details where you can contact me if possibly there's a question that comes up. If not today, then tomorrow or next week, but that's where you'll find us. But yeah, I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank you all for listening. And then if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those. Thanks. Okay, so I am just going to ask Alriza maybe to just assist me with the chat.
Thank you so much, Chantal, and thank you for your very interesting presentation. Appreciate your time. It doesn't look like we have anything in the chat box at the moment. So if anyone does have a question, please feel free to reach out to Chantal on the email address on the screen. Also, for those CPD participants, please remember that the assessment is on the system in category 2. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy your Friday.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.